timing is fantastic.
Right, okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So first of all, this is all green, and I've given you a copy of the slides, and most of it is based on what is in my book, which is called Thinking Systems, and my approach is very much a biological approach. As anybody who, if you look at the book, you'll see that that's the case. As far as this particular talk is concerned, is essentially chapter 8, but there are bits more than that in there as well. So I think there are lots of questions which are unanswered. So this is not a completed work by any means. It's so I'm hoping that we can engage. We've got 2 hours, so I'm hoping that you can be engaged, and maybe we can mull over some of the problems that there are in the way in which we approach things, as it were. My interest in democracy started long ago, when I suppose the motivation was I lived in the United States for a couple of years as a postdoctoral fellow, and the United States is very different to the UK, and this, of course, when you're a naive 25-year-old, it sort of surprises you that it's very different, because the propaganda in this country is always, oh, we're very like the United States, and everything works similarly, and they're much better at science and all those kinds of things. So as a young scientist, I went to the United States to find out, and didn't like it at all, really. The social side of things. So science was very good,
Whereabouts in the States?
University of Rochester in Upper New York State, near Lake Ontario. Yeah. Toronto is actually the nearest big city, and I had a cousin in Toronto, so I often went to Toronto when I was living there, and liked Canada quite a lot. It's very different. I came back to this country and joined the Labour Party, because I didn't want us to be going down that road. And as you can see, complete failure. But I did spend 10 years basically with my then wife running a constituency party. I became treasurer in 1974. And was treasurer for 7 years, and then for subsequent 3 years I was vice chair of the constituency. I've got a lot of experience, and I ended up with the question, why doesn't democracy work? Because it clearly doesn't, what we call democracy in any case. And so that's where I sort of started from. And about 1979, I suppose, something like that, came across Stafford Beer's work, some of the books, read them, and discovered from the books that I lived quite near, because this was in Pembrokeshire in West Wales, to where Stafford was in Lampeter. And managed to contact him and met him first of all in 1983, and then had many conversations over the years subsequent to that until he died in 2002. So I think, sort of those conversations did give me some understanding, but I think it took me probably 20 years to really understand what the VSM was all about. And that's where I think I'm now coming from, that understanding that I developed both in conversation with Stafford and on my own kind of thing, because I think in the end there are some points of which we disagreed, which was interesting. So what I hope to do is run through this at reasonable sort of speed, but starting with a systemic framework, because I think that's very important indeed, and because there is a lot of controversy even within the systems community of exactly what the VSM is and what it means, and I think that needs to be, I'm coming from a very specific point of view about that, and I want to just try and describe that. And then starting to apply the VSM to the situation, how do we construct a democracy? And then, obviously, first of all, what is democracy? Can we make a reasonable definition of what democracy is? And then looking at, so I'm assuming now the structure of the VSM, and then want to look at each of the systems as defined in the VSM and how would we interpret them in terms of this democracy. And in particular then, because system 2 is very, very important in this situation, in this context, do a bit more in detailed exploration of that. And then put what for me is perhaps the biggest question. What I've done through to that point is not really thought about how you deal with organizations. So how do organizations now fit into this structure? Because clearly there's got to be relationships which we've got to look after between individuals and organizations, and I'm excluding from that the actual organizations of governing. So, you know, your telecoms organizations, all the normal commercial organizations and charities and all those kinds of things. So how do we fit that into this kind of picture? And for me, that's very much work in progress. I have some ideas, but that's about all. And then, of course, how do we get there from here? Which is a long way from where we end up in this structure. So, looking at what we might consider the core functions of governing, and this seems to be reasonable. Taken from a book by Levitt, Why Did Ancient States Collapse? And Diamond, who looked at how societies choose to fail or survive. Levitt doesn't really think about the natural environment, but obviously the natural environment is pretty important in all this, and Diamond does look at that a bit. So those are the kinds of things. And I think when you look at that list, we've got things at the top here. These first two are really the relationship between with the external environment. And the bottom ones here are all about how do we keep coherence.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
It's too interesting, this point. The first 3 points are also realized by a human body and
yes.
also by each cell. No? So,
yeah.
Each cell needs food and it needs to protect itself by the cell membrane.
Yeah.
It needs to transport everything to the outside, what
yeah.
should not be inside. And because that's so complex, it starts a symbiosis with a lot of other cells in a multicellular body where others organize the food transport, or the skin
yeah.
is responsible for protection. On the inside, it's the immune system.
Yeah.
And then if a lot of humans are together, so okay, someone else should go to look for the food. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it has to organize by the society,
yeah.
and the government has the job to realize it.
Yeah.
So a lot of functions of society are the same as the human body has and as each cell has. It has to do with how to realize growth and to protect itself.
Yeah.
This
yeah. Yes, all those
higher levels.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know whether you know, but of course, the viable system model (VSM) came originally from a study of the human body.
Yeah.
If you look at Stafford's early book, I suppose, Brain of the Firm, then he's doing exactly that analysis and doing. So, okay.
Does that make an observation?
Yeah. Go back to that.
I'm surprised not to see anything that mentions the word citizen.
Okay, well, I think when you're talking about ancient states, of course, they're rather smaller and maybe not have citizens, but yes, okay.
It's a bit like when you have a company and it talks about it, makes a statement like this, and you said, "Where's the word customer?"
Yeah.
It's that sort of.
Yeah.
Well, that's leather then, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what the job about them.
Okay, so first thing I want to fix this systemic framework, because I think this is really important. And what I'm looking at is society, and I'll use the word society for the moment, is a dynamic entity that exists in a dynamic world. I don't think anybody here is going to disagree with that. So that's the starting point. So what we need is a systemic framework. And my systemic framework is essentially like this. So we've got a society, there are outputs and there are inputs, and it exists in a geographic, an ecological, a social, and an economic environment, and there must be a good relationship, productive relationship between the society and that environment, which must be in terms of its ecologic, social, and economic situation. Otherwise, it isn't going to be viable.
Or at least the ones closest to them.
Yeah, of course you're going to return your whole room off onto here, or you can have the whole room on.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
That's a Robin.
I can see you though. So, I mean, the key thing here is it's dynamic. The whole thing is dynamic. These are flows. These are input flows and output flows. So this is not a static picture. And when we come to thinking about the system, then I'm going to define what I mean by purpose, and just say what I mean by purpose is that is something which stands for the relationship and is the totality of inputs and outputs of that system with its environment. Because I want to get over the flavour that this is teleological. It's going somewhere. It's not static. And I think this comes back to David's point this morning about weird thinking. Weird thinking being Western, educated, industrial. I can't remember what the R is, but democratic, I think, is the D or something like that. But something like that. And we in the West. Sorry.
Rational, I imagine.
Possibly, yeah, I can't remember. But it's a way of Western thinking which starts with Newton and has developed by the philosophers at that time, and is the way is our accepted way of thinking. And I mean, I'm a physicist by training, mathematician, physicist by training, and you look at I look at the physics world, and they find it very, very difficult to let go of this weird thinking. And if you do, it seems to me that the world looks a whole lot simpler place, kind of thing. And now just as far as the steering system is concerned, I'm going to call it a steering system at this moment because Plato wrote about it 2,500 years ago, that there was an analogy between steering a ship and governing a society. And 2,500 years ago, that was sort of the basic way of looking at it. And Ampere wrote 300 years ago about steering a society and used the word cybernetics, actually when in his writing. But if you look at governmental writing on government, certainly in the English language, I don't know about German, it's not mentioned. Cybernetics doesn't appear anywhere in writing on governance, but it is a cybernetic study. I mean, it's about exactly steering a society.
I know this is understood, but my son did business at university, and I've got all his books at home, all his standard books, and beer is not mentioned anywhere.
No.
Asby is not mentioned anywhere. You can go through the contents and it's been snowpaked out of everything.
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't fit into the standard weird world, if I can use that expression. For me, I think, I was talking to John Walker yesterday, and he drew me a sort of an analogy. I don't know if you've looked at the television and the Channel 4 logo, where it comes up on the screen and there's all sorts of bits and pieces all over the place, and then they change the perspective and suddenly the 4 comes into view. And that seems to me to be a good analogy for, if you're a weird thinker, it just looks like all these bits and pieces, but if you're a systems thinker, you can see precisely that 4. and I think lots of people, even people who call themselves systems thinkers. I had, when I was doing teaching for the OU, had the experience that my group I was teaching, as a tutor, I was marking them, and I sorted out the people who really seemed to understand what I called systems thinking, and they got very high marks for me. And then they were sat the exam, and everybody who got high marks with me got low marks, and the people who got low marks with me got high marks. And clearly we were coming from, whoever marked that exam paper, and it wasn't me, were coming from two very distinct perspectives. Hello, something says the battery's running low. I haven't turned on that. That's better. Uh-oh. Okay.
Back on.
The hamster triggered that.
Yes, okay. And the other fundamental bit here is, of course, the standard cybernetic feedback control model. We're in the realm of cybernetics. And what we are about is actually steering. So, in exactly the way the Greeks wrote about it. So we're trying to steer a society. And that is the dynamic system in a dynamic environment. And there's no way, it seems to me, that you can get around that. So we've got these three mathematical laws of cybernetics. So we've got to be able to say that these are satisfied. Ross Ashby's law of requisite variety, that if you are trying to control something, you've got to have as many options to steer as there are possible disturbances to the system. And now obviously for a society, that's immense. So that we need to be able to say that, okay, we're at least coming somewhere near that. And of course, when you look at the current governance systems, I'd say we're nowhere near that. The Conrad-Ashby theorem, which says that you should have the best possible model of your system within the controller in order to be able to do your best at controlling. And then the sub-optimization theorem, which says that you can't expect, if you try and optimize a sub-unit, you will not be able to optimize the whole. And we're always doing that, and of course that militates against capitalism, because we're always trying to, every company is trying to optimize its profits, which is sub-optimizing the whole system. So we're certainly well away from any way of optimizing the whole society kind of thing. Okay. So if we look at societies, I'm going to use the word community. Because community is a nice word in English because it applies to almost any group of people with some kind of association. So it could be a geographic community, people all living in the same place, or it could be a community of like-minded people, systems community like we have here, or a community of accountants, or all sorts of things. Now, well, I'm obviously going to start and focus on geographic communities, because that's what I want to do. If we think about humans, then of course the first communities were just small tribes of people who were probably somewhat related to each other, and that was self-governing. And as time went on, then there was progress, people starting to build tools and develop different skills. Then you get the idea of people exchanging things, and so you get exchange relationships, the sort of thing that Clemens was talking about this morning, and that's also very important. So if I then just, and we got there saying, okay, well, if we're using the VSM, then the VSM divides into subunits, and those subunits are sub-processes. So again, this is a dynamic picture. The trouble is you can't put dynamics, I mean, I'm not good enough with, I'm sure I could have nice running arrows if I was good enough to do that. To say there are flow, these are all arrows represent flows, and that would be a dynamic picture. Now, I was going to say something, but it's gone out of my head now. What was I going to say? Oh, okay, I'm with that. Right, okay. So the first thing about the VSM is, of course, the recursive levels, which we can see here. And I think when you look at present governing structures, they are not recursive in the way the VSM wants them to be. If you look at ours in Great Britain, it's a complete mess. Tam Dalyell, one of our MPs who died some years ago, proposed what's called the West Lothian question. And this, in the sort of general governing writing that exists now, is sort of considered to be not solvable. And that is, should Westminster MPs from Scotland be able to vote on English laws which apply only to England? And this is just a question of how do you relate an upper level, the level of the larger community, to the level of the sub-community. And I don't understand why people believe that it's not solvable, because they solve it every day when they look at any football game, for example, because the football game is played to a set of rules, and that rule applies to everybody on the field. And each of the teams can choose their own strategies and playing methods, but they have to stay within that set of rules. So it's exactly what we need for our recursive structure. We have a framework set of rules for the whole community, and the sub-communities then can add to those rules, which relate to their cultures, but not subtract from them. So that's a very easy thing to understand. So I really don't understand why it's viewed as not solvable. Okay, so we've got the community, and we get recursion by default. There's recursion. We have nations, we've got towns and villages, and they usually do have some method of local governing within that. And there are communities of neighbourhoods within that again. And of course, this is a very simplified picture. So it's just the principle I'm trying to illustrate is just the principles of what we are trying to do. Yeah.
Sorry, just on your previous slide, it feels to me that the problem is probably the level of abstraction at which that framework is specified. So, for example, the problem we've got in our organization is like, we don't have enough accountability and feedback. One of the implementations to achieve that might be line management, but you could imagine other implementations. But if we say at the community level, everyone must have a line manager, like you're confusing the level, even like now you've specified implementation as opposed to like the principle. And I imagine the point you said about culture is really important, because if people are subscribing how these things are to be implemented, then you run into all the cultural clashes that are at odds with the principles that you're actually trying to embed.
Yeah, and well, I think the other thing about sort of drawing attention to line management is, of course, line management tends to occur in a hierarchy where the power is at the top, kind of thing. Whereas here, in this kind of structure, then the power is limited at the top, because if you're just limiting yourself to setting the framework rules, and you're not allowed to set the individual sort of lower level rules, that these are then doing that, adding to the section another layer of rules and a further layer of rules, then that's rather different.
One observation I've make is that the communities and towns and villages used to be towns and villages, but when they did a local authority reorganisation a while ago, they accumulated, I presume for efficiency reasons, they moved away from town councils to borough councils.
Yeah.
Boroughs are quite
Yeah.
orderly.
Yeah.
And they don't have identity in the same way that towns and villages.
Yeah.
Very true.
Absolutely. Yes.
Counties
So,
became these other bodies.
to some extent, the decisions are easier if you've got a place with an identity, and once you get, you've got lots of different places, and you're trying to, and people lose that emotional connection.
Yes.
Counts as well.
But if we had a stronger emotional connection at the next level down, like us and 30 other households around us, we wouldn't worry so much about that identity because ours would all be fixed
Yeah.
at a lower level.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things about that though is that because of this, there's been this drift up, isn't there, of governments away from.
Yeah.
Then not only do you have that, but I think the other thing about it, you can link it to your idea of who actually is responsible, who does, where is management occurring. This disappearance of autonomy.
Yes.
And I've seen from that a complete disengagement with all of the processes because nothing an individual can do, including voting, can have any influence on the things that happen to them. So people just not bothering anymore.
Yeah, well, certainly they're walking away from governance because, I mean, I'm involved in some community stuff around orchards.
Yeah.
And one of the things about that, even though people are still involved in orchard upkeep, they don't involve the council because they don't perceive the council actually offers any help. What it does is act as a barrier, so you need risk assessments and this, that and the other.
Absolutely.
Just go out there with the tools now
Yeah.
Just do stuff.
and just go out there and just do it and then we'll take the risk. If I'm going out with a cloud streamer, I'm just going to go out there and do it. I don't care because nothing above helps me. It's
And
all
also
barriers.
there isn't the capacity to monitor it either. So I can do it with impunity actually because there's no auditing either. Sorry, Roger.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Really
okay.
interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, and let's carry on anyway. And
One question, maybe can also be explained there. So I know from the YB system model, says it is recursive. You have higher levels consisting of the same model on the lower level. For me, what I observe in reality is more that I'm embedded in several higher level systems. Now I'm part of our family. I'm married with 3 children, so I'm part of the family system, and I'm part of the Siemens system, and I'm also a citizen.
yeah.
So it's not one system which I can aggregate, and then I have all nations together.
Exactly.
It's
Yes.
more, I don't know what is the polyhierarchy.
Yeah.
We have a network, and this is where the role conflicts come from, because I'm a family father, I want to be at home, and at the same moment Siemens wants me to work every night and day. So I have different systems above.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a
I
good.
already have inside Siemens.
Yeah. That's a very good point, because I see governance, or governing, if you like, as the dynamic, as the most complex thing we are trying to do. I think it's much more complex than trying to run an organisation which has a purpose, and a singular purpose. Because where is the purpose? We haven't talked about that yet. Because what is the purpose of a community? So let's come to that. So if I'm doing the standard VSM analysis, then we get this kind of picture, that the model, as you say, is the same at all levels. We've got a governing system governing the whole community, and then we've got the sub-governing systems which are governing the sub-communities, and then of course the sub-communities governed by their management systems. So that's the VSM analysis picture that I'm trying to work with. And to start with, I'm just confining myself, if you like, to geographic communities. So yes, I recognize that there are many other different kinds of communities for the moment, but I put that on one side just for the moment, and we'll come to that. Okay. So now let's try and define democracy. So what we've learned from the Conant-Ashby theorem, it requires that the control model is the best possible control model that we can have, that it's got to contain as much of much variety, if you like, what we would call variety of potential command, which and then it's through the governing system that we're trying to design that those minds are brought to bear. So we want to try and use everybody's mind, and we want to design a system which, as far as possible, will bring all the expertise from all those minds to bear on how we govern the community. And I think to some extent we've got a much more difficult job than the cell has got because this is much looser. The cell has been defined by millions of years of evolution. So it's solved all the problems by now. All the others have fallen by the wayside. But, I mean, human societies haven't got that. They're much looser than that. So we've got to be able to develop ways of confining people's actions to the ones we need to keep this system viable, and to use all the brain power that we can to do that.
So are we saying then that democracy is the capacity to use your mind in the governing of your own community?
Yes.
So that basically your mind matters.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as you...
has an impact on what might be the likelihood.
Yes. Yeah, so, I mean, as you said previously, that people are turned off because they can't affect anything. So we want to be able to include them in the governing system.
Is it about, is it like problem oriented, like we want everyone's input towards this problem, or is it oriented around the minds, i.e. like agency? Because I guess the one is sort of, there are a clear set of things that are trying to maximize like overall health and well-being, whatever it is, and we want everyone's, it's almost more like technocratic, we want everyone's like expertise on that, or this is what the majority wants and that is reflected in the decisions we make, or this is what everyone wants and that's reflected in the decisions we make.
To some extent, yes, but it's probably more subtle than that. I mean, because some people will perhaps not want to be involved in it, and we've got to be able to allow that. So I think forcing people to vote, for example, is not necessarily a good idea. But we want to include them if they've got a good point to make, if they feel that they've got something they want to say, kind of thing. Somehow they've got to be a mechanism to allow them to say that, and influence, at least in discussion. Maybe it's a silly point of view, but at least they get to contribute it, and then there is a discussion, which then hopefully, if it's a silly point of view, it persuades them that it is a silly point of view, or sort of at least they're kept inclusively in their community, kind of thing.
I'm going to say something that sounds wildly fascist. Bear with me. How do we sort of reconcile this with some of the crowd theories that we know around people and groups act from the lowest common denominator?
I think, well, maybe can we leave that on one side and come back to it? I think maybe that's a very good question, and I think we'll need to look at that with a bit more information. Okay, so my working definition is this. Democracy is a system which, as far as possible, brings all the minds in the community to bear on the problem of maintaining the viability of that community. Very loose, but that's what we're trying to get at.
That's actually quite modest. So maintaining the viability means you carry on surviving.
Yes.
That is modest, but that's the minimum you want.
That's the minimum, right?
Yeah.
And on sort of thriving would be a bit more than just surviving.
Yes.
That's what I'd be aiming for.
We might only get surviving though.
Well, it depends on your interpretation of the term maintaining the viability.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because if maintaining viability also means people feel happy there and personal growth and creativity and art and culture are part of that viability, that's okay.
Yeah.
If it's subsistence farming in its rawest form and all you're doing is just not starving, that's a different level of viability, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's the minimum we
Yes.
would aim to get for the whole community, which would be a change from it happening to some of the community and not the rest.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that would be a levelling up.
Yeah.
That.
And then you get an interaction maybe between the kind of this and Maslow and Graves.
Yeah.
Don't you? Because
Yes.
you know, low level Graves is very, very basic. High level Graves is a different space.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. David.
I think the Prime Minister of Finland was asked, what's the purpose of your government? And she said, it's to enable the well-being of our citizens.
Yeah.
Which sounds a bit different from the purpose of the present government, which is to win the next election.
Yeah.
To enrich our friends.
To enrich our friends.
But they teach systems thinking in Finland
They do.
Okay.
as
Yeah.
part of the education system.
Yeah. Well, that's a good idea, I think. And that's an idea which has been around for a long time. Right. So, okay, I now want to just jump straight in, and we'll use the VSM to try and explore what control system we need for a community. And I'm just, this is general. We're just trying to draw some guidelines for any of our communities, whatever level of recursion. So, viable system model is has this structure. The control system. We've got system 5, 4, 3, 2, and a 3-star. And I don't know how familiar you are with the VSM.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Is that okay? We don't need to explain any of that. Okay. Right. Okay. So if I go then to system 5 of the community, what would that be? The purpose of system 5 is to embody the being of the community as it's the guardian of the identity and purpose of the community. Now, of course, most communities don't really think about these things at all. Some do, and I happen to be in a little town in southwest France when I was writing the section of my book which was about this. And it occurred to me that this particular town had thought about its purpose, and it decided it wanted, sometime in the 70s, it decided it wanted to be a holiday town. It was had a lovely sandy beach, and but that sandy beach was on the open Atlantic from the Bay of Biscay, so quite often, of course, swimming there is quite dangerous. So they decided to build a lake, and they got money from the French government. It was remind me.
Yes. He came from there.
He came from there. One of the Mitterrand came from that area, and so he funneled money down there, and they used it for this purpose. And they built this lake. They built loads and loads of apartments which people could stay in, and the population, winter population is something like 1,700. The summer population is, I don't know, it's in the many tens of thousands, as everybody comes there on holiday kind of thing. Now, of course, the question is, in the current environment, with global warming, sea level rise, and all that kind of thing, how long is this going to be viable? But, of course, up to now, from the 70s till now, it's been a viable community. And one of the things I was involved in Todmorden in West Yorkshire, when our further education college was about to be demolished, was to take part in a fight which was to save this college from demolition. It was going to become a part of a car park for an Aldi supermarket, and we did actually save it. What we said was, okay, well, Todmorden was in the Industrial Revolution one of the leaders in developing the industry around cotton weaving and wool weaving, and the engineering was necessary to do that, and all the repair services for the looms and all that kind of thing, and construction services. We should be doing the same thing for this revolution, which is the climate change revolution. We should be developing people who can do things like deal with solar panels, deal with building which doesn't use concrete, deal with eco-based agriculture, and we did in fact achieve setting it up. And in fact, I mean, this comes to what I was seeing the parallels between Nikki's work and what I tried to do there was try to keep that focus on that development, and which was very difficult because nobody else, well, there were 2 other people who had that same focus, but it was very difficult to keep the whole thing on that track. And so I've now stepped back and let it go, and let's see what happens. But so,
one question.
Yeah.
System 5 question. I've heard, I think this was in Bhutan, where the king of Bhutan said he wants the maximum well-being of all citizens. And then the question was, what is the meaning of well-being? And then they made some studies and asked a lot of people what is really influencing your well-being. It's okay if you have a job and if you have a large family, or you have the comfort to travel inside. And this, all this question, what is well-being? Would you see this as part of System 5?
Yeah.
To get an understanding what the target is, also quantitatively. So you say, okay, this is, we have a good understanding of the direction we want to go.
Yeah.
In here now and in the future.
I would suggest that System 5 is less quantitative and more qualitative, and more hedonic. How does it feel?
Yeah.
Much more how does it feel rather than, so you get into quantitative as you go down into System 3, and 3 start very much so. But for me, System 5 has always been about what does it feel like to be here.
And this would be at the level of a community where you know a lot of people. I mean, if we're talking...
The lowest level, certainly, yes.
Yeah, the lowest level. Then this is about things you actually personally understand because they're part of your own life that you live on a daily basis. So it's quite easy to see what you might consider to be well-being at that level, I think. It's much more difficult to think about what's a nation's well-being, but you probably have a good idea of what your well-being is.
And one of the things I'm sitting sort of oscillating between which level am I at here is I'm here in a city that says, might identify itself as a university city and has that identity. But I think probably a part of the community will identify as being part of a university city, and a part of it won't. So at what level do you have a cohesive identity of community? It's probably lower down rather than multiple views of what the community you're in, and geographically speaking, has a purpose for.
So you wouldn't try to identify that from the top down, would you? You'd wait to see what all its contained communities felt was well-being, and then you put that in the next one.
But it doesn't necessarily get to a single identity and purpose at the top.
No, it probably doesn't.
You do come back to a little bit to what Amy was talking about the lowest common denominator too. Because the democracy to some extent does function on that level, because whilst Manchester might not agree about whether it's industrial, whether it's university, or whether it's something else, or technology city, which is trying to talk about, or transport city, what it does agree about, and perhaps the lowest common denominator about this city, is that it agrees that it's large and has aspirations of importance.
Yeah.
And it prides itself on being radical.
Yes, qualitative.
It prides itself on being radical.
Yeah, but that's okay, because it's like the liver and the kidneys and the heart. They're very different, and their purposes are different, but they do come together to be a coherent whole. And so that's the sort of thing we would be looking for.
They come together for the well-being of that community.
Yes.
So you do not have to decide, is the liver more important than the heart? Because System 5, we are all part of the same thing. We focus on what we are together, we are a human body, which has different parts which play their role, and they have to be balanced. No? So with industry, and we need university, and look at the environment, and we need a kindergarten, everything as well. And then the conflicts between them are on a lower level. No? So we have to focus on those.
We're talking about a self-organising system. So something that doesn't identify with it can choose to go somewhere else that it does identify with.
Or just to think of it differently.
So we want to be able to say, well, who's going to be here? Well, I think at the lowest recursive levels, maybe all members of that community. I don't know how, I'm not saying where that might break down, but it's going to break down somewhere. I mean, when you've got 90 million people or whatever, you're not going to be able to do that. So we need then some kind of House of Representatives. And we need to be able to enable people to be elected to that, chosen for that through a sortition system, maybe. There needs to be some method of getting people as representatives and understanding that they are representatives of the culture and attitudes of the people that they come from. They're not there to fight for them. And I think what we muddle up in this country is we think of representative as somebody who's going to fight for us, because the lawyers have got hold of it and have made it like that, whereas it isn't that at all. It should be that they're just there to make decisions about the whole community, and only the whole community, in order to keep that system 5 as a holistic, or the whole community in a way it's got to be coherent and holistic and all those things that we've just been talking about. So that seems to me to be the general shape that we want. Now, I'm not going to define it any more than that, because I don't think we can in the time we've got, and there's going to be lots of numerical stuff there. And just what I've said, all decisions taken by the House of Representatives must be decisions on matters pertinent to the whole community. And they can't interfere in, not like you can in a hierarchy, interfere in the lower levels.
I think there's a really interesting question here, isn't there, about what representation actually means.
Yes.
And how representation is organised. I know whether you were going to explore that, but for me, to take the critical issues about whether representation is independent, political, ethical, religious, because that seems to have huge impact on who is represented and how they're represented.
Yeah.
If we're saying that the representative has to be representative of the culture and attitudes of the community, then the community is probably a reasonable judge of who might embody that well.
Yeah.
So it comes from the bottom up.
Yeah.
And it has to be somebody from the community, presumably. You can't have, somebody parachuted in from some other community to represent your community.
But that's exactly what we have now in this democracy.
Yes.
Yeah.
As an interesting example, we have someone flown in, to, say, a safe, seat to represent the Conservative Party, who comes from some completely different part of the country.
But this isn't
There's
representing a political party at all. This is representing a group of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what was representation actually mean?
Yes.
It's really critical to this.
It's critical, that's right. But I think once you begin to understand that they can't be supporting people individually, as what happens now. I mean, a lot of our corruption comes from that sort of thing. They've got to only be able to take decisions about the whole thing. They can't be saying, well, I like him, so I'm going to pass his planning permission kind of thing. That's excluded.
So it's interesting that you take like the around representation, that's where I'd like to explore definition more. For me, system boundary and pertinence is where I would like to explore definition more, because depending on where you say this is the community, is then that, and then the question of what do we consider pertinent or not pertinent, that becomes really interesting when you start talking about things like women's rights, or if you get really specific and you talk about abortion.
Yeah. Yeah. But those are things which are almost at the level of the whole planet kind of thing. I mean, and women's rights must be the same as men's rights across the whole planet. And this is part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, let's say, which lots of countries don't go anywhere near.
But in an extremely narrow definition of pertinent, you could only have women of, who had experienced pregnancy or abortion or something, like in a really narrow definition, pertinence could like really dramatically limit who makes those kinds of decisions.
Well, let's go on, because I think that this has some bearing on that. System 4. So the purpose of System 4 is to monitor the environment in a learning feedback loop and propose changes that it feels are necessary for the continuing viability of the community. Is that reasonable?
Yeah.
And if we want to try and do something about that, what I'm suggesting is that every person has skill and expertise and should be able to contribute to the viability of the community using that skill and expertise. So the better, because we're now a very complex society, if you go back to the Middle Ages, then the whole of this country, for example, and probably the whole of Europe, was a very much an agrarian society, so it was the same everywhere. So having representatives from across that country in one body was enough, but I don't think that's enough now. I think we need more than that. So I'm saying that we should perhaps have a System 4 body which people can be elected to or chosen for on the lines of their skill sets. So,
one question to System 4. Maybe here in Manchester, for example, I know the direct environment if I'm citizen of Manchester. So my perception of the world is really direct. And the higher the system is, like the UK or higher system, I only know everything indirectly via mass media. So all System 4s, what we have, if you involve everybody, has the same knowledge which comes from a lot of companies that drive the mass media.
Yeah.
And there's a high absorption rate of reality. And
well, that's another thing to change, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm saying if say, for example, I'm a builder, then I should be able to elect a representative, or I should be able to stand for election, or I could be chosen as a builder to represent builders at that System 4 level for the communities underneath, so the sub-communities, so every person should be registered in an expertise constituency, just as they're registered in a geographic community in the current electoral registers, and so people would fall into. Some people, of course, are multi-skilled, but they should then choose where they think they can put their effort best in one of their skill areas and be elected to that, if that's what they want to do. So I'm going to call this the House of Expertise.
On the previous slide, what's SIC? I'm sorry.
Oh, Standard Industrial Codes.
Standard
Industrial Codes. When you register a company, you have to put it into a category of what its purpose is.
There is a slight gap in it because it doesn't really deal well with anything that's not a company.
Yeah.
So I think
Just probably the biggest gap with it is, so if you wanted to register a community orchard organisation,
you would have to have another.
there is nothing in the SCiO.
No.
An expanded form of it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think there's only about 3 agricultural categories. I think it's got very simplistic. Yes.
The UN has an expanded model that's quite good.
Does it?
Yeah, I think, and it's an example of how you can actually put together some categorisation, which would be, I mean, you would be in some sort of, you might decide to be in a growing one, or you might decide that, in fact, your personal expertise was in the development and management of organisations like that. You'd be in a different one.
So, I mean, obviously this is a big job to develop such a register, but nevertheless, it's something which seems to me to be needed, and we don't do it very well. We've got sort of our House of Lords is somewhere towards that, because people are elected with skill sets to the House of Lords because they've long service and expertise in some particular area, but of course it gets muddled up with other things as well. So, I mean, at the lowest recursive level, we can just get all our builders together and just say, okay, well, what do we need to do in order to keep up with the building, how the world is developing as far as building is concerned, or as far as agriculture is concerned, and they should know what's necessary. And at higher levels, then, in exactly the way we did before with geographic communities, we can elect from there. So we're at least getting 2 goes at developing something. So how do we ensure that then the House of Representatives does satisfy, and the House of Expertise does satisfy, to maximize their variety of potential command? So there's obviously education necessary here. And so what I'm suggesting is maybe that what we could do is just say you can't serve at the next higher level until you've served at this lower level. So at least you've got some practice at the community level before you try and step up, as Clemens was talking about there, because people's view is of their local community, and now they've done something at that level, then they can go and engage at the next higher level. And I mean, obviously some people will never want to do that at all, but it does create a pool of people at any level that you can, over time, that you can elect from the next higher level. And I think for me, when I was engaged in politics, one of the things that happened to me was, as treasurer of a Labour Party, we had Labour clubs, and these Labour clubs, there were 2, one of them was going bust every so often, and so I was called in, because I was a mathematician, and say, well, can you sort it out? So you'd sort it out, and then you see a year or 2 later it would be doing the same thing again. And then it was obvious that they didn't have any financial expertise. They were elected to the committee because they wanted cheap beer, and so they just brought the cost of the beer down until they were non-viable, and then of course it went and we had to get together and say, well, you can't do that because you're not making enough money to cover your expenses, and so on, you know, the usual sort of system story. So education is clearly a part of any management function, and we need to do that and build that in. And then how do we keep the evolution of the houses to keep in step with the evolution of the community? Because that's obviously, I mean, it looks fairly clear to me that in the UK, and I read that, and in the US too, that the people are somewhat more radical than the governments are in terms of the way that they want the country to go. And you see things like in this country that, I don't know what the figures are now, but 2/3 of the Tory party people who vote Tory want to nationalise the railways. Well, the railways are never nationalised. And that kind of thing. So we need to be able to keep these things in step, because otherwise we just go down the crazy route that we're sort of going down in this country.
So there is a real question here about the validity of representation, isn't there?
Yes.
About I'm using the example from Kansas, where they had the referendum where the populace said that actually, regardless of the lawmakers and the church campaigning, that they reject absolutely the restrictions in abortion.
Yeah.
They said they were not doing it, even though the legislators wanted to do it. The referendum said you are not bloody doing it, because the people did not want that. That makes me think about the representation is clearly not keeping step.
Yes.
At all, is it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So my suggested solution is that the world evolves, so should these houses, and therefore elections should be spread and not all occur one particular moment in time, which makes it very vulnerable to people who control the information getting through, and somebody can stand up and say all sorts of nonsense, like we heard with Trump or Johnson, and it persuades the country that we'll elect this lot because they sound good. So if you spread it over time, then you could have a constituency every week or a constituency every couple of weeks or something like that. Then the parliament or whatever it has evolves, and it doesn't actually just suddenly change course, which is a much better biological statement than what we have at the moment.
Is there an argument here, Robin, for maximum terms?
Yes, I think there is.
Lots of roles don't have maximum terms.
Yeah. Because if you are going to, I mean, for example, when I was an active Labour Party member, I knew the man who was elected, he was a GP in fact, who was elected for the next door constituency in Carmarthenshire. And he went to Parliament very much saying, well, I'm going to represent the people. But within 2 years, he was coming back and telling us what we should think, because that's what Parliament wanted to do, kind of thing. So he was representing Parliament to us. So the whole thing broke down, and I don't think he knew that that had happened. But it was clear that it had. Being on the...
At a much lower level, when we embed our staff into a customer team, we call that going native.
Yeah.
When rather than being the constructive challenge and they say, you know, I'm independent, they then suddenly get locked up in that system, and to be credible and viable as an individual in that system, they have to take on
Yes.
culture and the ethics.
Yes, well, there's lots of research on that, isn't there? Yeah.
What would be your ideal period of service then?
Certainly no more than 10 years. I think probably less than that. Maybe just 5 years or something like that. I mean, we're talking about sort of national level now, but because it might be even shorter for the lower levels. You can...
You've got this trade space of stability versus constant flux, haven't you?
Yeah.
Because it consumes resources to change.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Swiss model?
A little, but not. I wouldn't say I'm very familiar.
I'd love to see how it tests against this, because I don't know that much about it either. But what I do know about it is very interesting.
Yes, because they use referendums quite often, I think.
And they also don't have a single president.
No. No, well, of course, there's no single president here. I mean, they'll...
More mixed, isn't it? 'Cause if you look at that, there's some representative democracy, there's some sort of plebiscite democracy by the referendum system, and the canton structure that then overlays that as well.
And the profession of each of the 7 people that sort of stand in place of the president is like really important part of their identity and how they influence the country.
So coming back to this expertise thing, goes change the education system, having no expertise in education.
Yes.
Yeah, well, God,
Yes.
it's been like that for decades.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, their views seem to me to be, having been in education for the whole of my lifetime, seem very medieval. I mean...
Going back to the Swiss thing, in the 60s, my mother had a very close Swiss friend who came to stay. And in the 60s, women didn't have the vote.
No, that's the thing.
And when we sort of went, "Ooh, you don't have the vote, how terrible." She said, "No, it's great." She said, "I don't have to keep reading up on things so I can vote in referendums." So she was, which I found was amazing. But it does go to show that they were taking seriously the need to understand issues before they voted on them.
Yes.
So, would you only have one? I mean, I'm just thinking about the representation of women. Would you have a man and a woman, or would you have representatives? You know, well, because then it's quite difficult, doesn't it? Because there's more genders than
I was going to say,
men and women.
binary, is it?
Yeah, no, it's not. No, okay, forget the question.
Wouldn't that be captured by the culture?
Yeah, and the
identity
attitudes,
group
yeah.
rather than by the experience group?
Absolutely, yes. I can
Yeah.
imagine in the town we used to live in, there'd always be women, actually, just because those are the women who are active in the community.
Yeah. Okay. System 3 and 3 star, just deal with these together because in a way...
Before you go on, what is 3 star? I know I've said 3, but I've never heard of 3 star.
3 star is the auditing function, so you will understand that.
I do, but it's not like accounting audit, it's a sporadic, no notice given type of audit, picking up what's going on.
Now we want to know whether these people are telling us what they're telling us about what they're doing is the same as what they're doing. And that can be quite a gap sometimes in any organisation.
And almost by implication, it bypasses the level of the marzipan layer in the middle. So if you're auditing, you're not auditing below you, you're jumping that level, ideally, and going below that, going what's really going on.
Yeah.
It's monitoring for signs of stress. So in this context, it's useful to understand whether there's a particular community that is stressed because it doesn't have the right representation or expertise present in those discussions.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So the purpose of System 3 is to maintain a whole community view in engaging with and managing the sub-communities, steering the internal system in line with the external requirements. So I'll just jump on to is it the next slide, I think? Okay, let me just go to there first because I think that's important, that there is this ongoing conversation between those who are responsible for checking on the outside world and those who are responsible for checking on the inside world, as it were, and managing the inside world to make sure that they stay in step with each other. So this conversation is, so VSM envisages this continuing discussion between systems 4 and 3, informing each other of their respective areas that they're looking after. And so are the efforts of the citizens aligned with the future or evolution of the environment? That kind of conversation. So when we go back to here, we've got an executive arm really who's deciding, and I think this is I saw as very much connected with what you were saying this morning, that here we are trying to steer the inside system to make sure that it is going to be able to cope with the external environment and keep the thing viable. And okay, we need a chief executive maybe, I don't know that we necessarily do, but if we do, then there's going to be appointed by System 5, so make sure that they are got the right kind of personality, attitudes, culture to deal with that.
Where does the idea of the wise, old, experienced person who can see what things used to be like when it worked, and I mean, some of what you're saying implies that you bring new people in all the time. If you bring new people in all the time, then you're never going to get anybody that ever heard of the VSM, are you?
Well, I mean, I was thinking, so when we were thinking about how long should these representatives serve for?
Well, it needs to be a mix, I would suggest.
Yeah.
You need the grey hairs as well.
Yes, well, one would hope that any System 4, System 3, System 5 would contain a mix. I mean, that's what we want. We don't want people all the same. I think one of the mistakes of our political parties in this case is to try and choose people who line up with the current whatever the current wish for the Prime Minister to have in his cabinet. And I think both the Labour Party and the Conservatives and possibly the Liberals, although they've not really had a chance to show it, but certainly both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party choose people to put into their constituencies who line up with the current views. And that's the worst thing you can do, because that means you've got no variety in your.
Dave's point, that if you are going to do the refresh, then perhaps you also need that perhaps there is the need to have the chair emeritus, the non-executive people in the executive side who are there whilst they are not necessarily pulling the levers, are there to advise.
Yes.
But also, if you've got this requirement for progression through the levels, so you can't be a representative at a higher recursive level until you've actually worked at the lower ones. That does add a period of time, doesn't it? You can't be nipping in at 22 up to the top with that. You will be that bit older.
And you can't nip in without skills.
Without skills, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That forces us all to get educated.
Okay, and the second point of this is that, in a sense, this loop is the heart of the feed-forward control system, whose purpose is to ensure that the community remains viable in a changing world. And I think this is where it sort of connects with what you were saying this morning, that we've got possible response systems, and we've got a meta view of the environment coming into system 4, and in the conversation between 4 and 3, we're then choosing how we respond. So there may be, maybe there's something we haven't got, so we need to build it, and that can be done.
So, in the past we had a lot of discussions also at Siemens how to balance the resources between the here and now and the later. Yeah? And the question is, if I put everything to the later, then I would die immediately, because I have a lot of work preparation and so on, and R&D projects, but my current customer projects are going down.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, I work in here now, I'm faster, but then I have no new products.
Yeah.
And the idea, if I want to compare it, what is the minimum that I survive now? Yeah, that's what I have to invest in the now, and the rest I can put to the later. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now it depends on how exactly do I know what is sufficient to survive now, so that I invest enough to be on the safe side, and I have no serious problems now, and I put the rest on growth. And the more unsure it is, how many people do I need to get this customer project running, the more I have to invest. So it's better to have a good insights and high predictability in the here and now. They say, okay, this is sufficient, and I'm on the safe side.
Yes.
Maybe I use HR methods to check it again and again and again, so that I can use the other resources for growth. And that's how we try to balance it. No? And it's a balancing between different times, here now and maybe mid-term, to be successful in 1, 2 or 3 years, or in the long term, 10 years.
Yeah.
And this is a permanent question what we have.
I think the Asby model obviously with that, because with the Asby model we have this idea of attenuation and amplification.
Yeah.
So you're attenuating your capability to what you want to be able to do, which is perhaps your now focus, your skill per system 1, what are we here to do, and then you're amplifying your variety to be able to do perhaps some things that are appearing immediately. There's some things which you go, well, actually that's coming around the corner. I'm going to need to be able to deal with that.
Yeah.
And actually that's a balance question and a balance dysfunction. Because if I look now, local authorities is a good example for that. They have no money to do any future amplification for variety. All that money has been taken away. And so the self-viability is killed.
Yes.
So actually it's central government killing the self-viability of local government by going, you can only just about do what you need to do now.
Yeah.
You cannot build any resilience to go with where it's going to go. It needs to do it.
Yeah, so
It's so helpful to think of the systemic concept of equifinality, which is that actually you can end up in a place from lots of different starting points, and from one starting point you can end up in lots of different endpoints. And in a way, in an open system like a nation state in the world at large, it probably doesn't matter too much as long as you're always aware of where you actually are. Because you will be somewhere, and somewhere will be good enough if you're following all your other rules about maintaining viability and getting the right information from the lower levels about how they are. So it may not, it's not like a cook's tool, or like a government saying, I promised this in the manifesto, and this is therefore what I've got to do. Not that they would do that anyway. You're not bound in quite the same way, are you? It's more like a meander through to the future, doing the best you can.
Yeah, well, I mean, my single hour is a bit, probably a bit misleading, because of course there will be in a community a number of these which are actually functioning at any one time, and you may simply be tweaking the amount of sort of what you want from any one of these lower level communities, because
The actual state will be an emergent.
yes, yeah, that's right, yeah. But then if you discover you need something new, then that's got to be developed. So
There's an element in there, but what do you deal with the negative systems that are going on, like social media untruths, for example, on vaccines? You know, how do you actually deal with that in a way that addresses the problems that generates?
okay, well, I mean, in a way, that's part of the feedback loop that comes up to.
Feedback loops. How do you do something about it?
Okay, well, we're going on to system 2, so let's have a look. So, to me, the purpose of system 2 is threefold. Firstly, to maintain the balance between the sub-communities, to make sure the whole thing is in some sort of balance. And then, secondly, to put in place, now we're talking legal frameworks to some extent, at the next lower level, within the higher level framework, required to maintain that internal coherence and viability, which then facilitates that third purpose, that is the appropriate support of the culture and values of that community. And my picture then gets, let's just finish this off first of all. So system 2 of the community is a body which consists of representatives of the next lower level of sub-communities appointed by the respective houses of representatives and the current level system 3. So you've got a combination of the overall view from system 3 and the views of the sub-units from appointed from the lower level, and they are making a new body which is somewhat like the Senate in the US, which states elect their representative, or yes, they do elect it, I think, their representative to go and be the Senate, which is a body which is now, they are supported, they are now got the problem of taking the views of a particular state into the discussion of the whole kind of thing. So we're now on the other side of that representation game. We've got a different meaning of the word representative, I think, here.
Can I ask you a question, Robin? If I just put my legitimacy question head on from critical systems heuristics, where you've got this idea of where is the place for someone who dissents with the direction that things are going or how things are being run? Is that the place where that gets heard in the system 2 part of it? So if someone says, we disagree with local traffic networks or low traffic networks, or we disagree with cycle routes, or we disagree with some other aspect, are they heard here?
Yes, thank you very much, yeah, I would think.
Isn't the first of your 3 purposes there fundamentally communist, in that you cannot put the individual ahead of the group?
In a sense, yes, but it's a mathematical theorem. You can't bucket it. If you try and optimize a subunit, you will not be optimizing the whole thing.
Yeah, it's a bit like Richard Murphy's stuff, isn't it, where he talks about advertising and competition and capitalism being suboptimal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, because you're optimising a part at the expense of the whole.
Yeah, creates waste.
Yeah.
Does all sorts of things, causes externalities in costs.
Why are these subcommittees appointed by the House of Representatives? I'm just curious about because they're sort of elected constituting these.
Yeah, we've got 2 levels involved here, so be careful with that. I've got a diagram later which will perhaps explain that a bit better, but yeah, so we're electing from the lower level, the sub-communities, to this house of this community collective. So they're coming up to represent the views of their individual communities and to develop a framework for everybody to work within, those individual communities to work within. And so there's the whole system view has to be there, and the subsystem views have to be there.
So that would be where any mechanisms, like Tony's suggesting, mechanisms for dissent, or if you like, alternative views, would be legislated to have a place. So
Yes.
you
Yes.
actually formalise the existence of the possibility, yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Because effectively, if you think about point one, I don't see point one potentially as being communist. I see it as communalist.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think those things are different. Because it's not born in an ideology.
No.
It's born in no individual group may attempt to sub-optimise by advantaging itself.
Well,
Yeah.
And so it says
Yeah.
neither the proletariat nor the aristocracy may sub-optimise.
But it's
That makes
between
sense.
as well. I mean, so I can't build my community around a leisure lake if I'm taking the water that the people who want to live by agriculture need downstream.
Yeah.
So I can't do it, or I can't do it absolutely.
We have to
Because
reach
I
accommodations.
have to think about the people
Yeah.
who also want to do
Yes.
something. And they can't demand that I don't have a lake of some sort. You know, so it's conversations all the time, which is what the VSM is all about. All those lines in the VSM are two-way conversation. You know, so it's...
But actually, so that's an interesting point because, you know, if you go back to your Swiss example about certain people saying they didn't have to think about it. You could argue that the populace is lazy
Yes.
when it comes to decision making about. It complains when decisions are made that it doesn't like. But actually, I always argue if you didn't vote, then keep your mouth shut because you didn't actually express an opinion. Don't complain about the people who represent you in Parliament because you didn't actually vote for anyone, so don't care. So you didn't actually care then. So people have to. It's difficult, isn't it? Because people actually have to participate
Yes.
in order to be legitimate.
Yeah.
But a part of that in the States, isn't it? It's likely to be abortion and Rose and Wade, isn't it? With a lot of women on all sides taking the culture and values of abortion and the rights to do that might just swing the whole American election.
Yeah. Coming back to the point about communism, I think Thomas Piketty makes the point that in the West we essentially fetishize the private ownership so that all property should be privately owned kind of thing. And in the communist world, or the Soviet communist world, there would be no private property. So even in the case of this small donkey cart which somebody delivers produce around the village, that couldn't be owned by the person who just runs it kind of thing.
In fact, Lenin drove a cart and horse through the middle of all of that. Because in the early days of the Russian state, Lenin realised that Marx's original aspiration to have everything collectively owned was never going to work. Right? It was i.e. that it clashed with human nature. And he just argued that actually there should be a level at which private ownership and private enterprise should be encouraged and supported. So that actually, of course, Lenin didn't survive for that long, and those who took over from him then squashed that idea.
But you can see there can easily be a balance. So in a community, individuals own their own houses perhaps, but maybe collectively they own the doctor's practice if it was private, for example. So you'd have levels of ownership.
I think the reason that I sort of call attention to that is because in the past we've had really big difficulty aligning communism with democracy and communism with capitalism. I mean, they're fundamentally at opposite ends of the same scale. And like there's kind of a saturation point at which like if you're running off some pretty key communist pillars, you can't be a democracy and you like capitalism becomes a thing that you can't have. I'm not saying necessarily that those things are bad, but it does sort of bring into question if what we're doing is engineering democracy here and we're resting on some pretty key communist pillars. Are we engineering democracy?
No, because in fact the argument here, I think, is just an economic one. There are some public goods which it's not in the private capitalist interest to provide because it's too expensive for them to do it. And there's also this issue of the free rider, that if you've got a highway, then people who pay road tax can use it, but other people can use it as well, or they don't pay road tax in this country, for example. So there is a whole class of goods which it's not really reasonable for the private sector to provide and then take the profits for their shareholders. There's an absolute role for a communal provision of some things. Now, I wouldn't call that communism, I would just call that sound economics, because I'm an economist, you see, not a
Well, so we've got energy security.
Yeah, well, yes.
That's one of those things. So in order for a community, our nation, to be viable, decisions about energy security have to be taken at that level. And because people at the lower levels aren't going to optimise for the whole, then some of those things should be owned by those decisions set at that level. I don't think that's a communist thing. I think that's a good governance.
You could put different words on it and actually put a completely different concept on it. So I would replace the whole idea versus capitalism versus communism with Jane Jacobs' thinking, which is around guardianship and enterprise.
Yes.
And you can think about the guardianship part, which is communalist. And that has a place at a certain level. And then you have an enterprise part, which is traditionally regarded as being the capitalistic bit. And the two have to intermesh in some way. But of course, you want them to intermesh in the right way rather than in a dysfunctional way. Because when you get the dysfunctional one, then you get the monstrous hybrid, which is effectively where you have a very powerful thing in anyone. The thing that doesn't work, but it's totally corrupted.
That's right.
Is that Trevor Hilder's moral
Systems of Survival, this book.
Yeah, he kind of developed, Trevor Hilder did a sort of
he has
extension of that, didn't he?
Yes, he has. But it's a really powerful set of ideas. And for me, it's much more powerful than the argument about communism versus capitalism.
It's not about communism, I don't think I mean, for example, what I'm talking about, the economic ideas, that was standard economics when I first learned economics in the 70s. So you get sort of, you do get moral panics about things which serve the people who promote them for all sorts of purposes. I mean, if you're an extreme capitalist party that doesn't want any possibility that you couldn't funnel out some of the public money into your own pocket, then you will be talking about, lefty socialists and communists, but you're not necessarily talking sensible economics or sensible social activity at all. I mean, that's the problem, as we heard before about the media. There's something going on in our society which, if you like, overrides everything else that we might be thinking and trying to talk about, which is the interests of a particular group who have the voice.
David.
Okay.
Going back to the last thing about abortion, at what stage does Make America Great Again and Trump become the accepted way forward for democracy when that doesn't any longer become democracy? I don't think that if the Republicans were to win on a Trumpist kind of thing, I don't think that would lead to better democracy.
No, not at all. I mean, they're
the vote of the people.
Yes.
So is that democracy?
Well, Trump is arguably a monstrous hybrid.
Yes.
Trump is arguably a monstrous hybrid. It's a guardianship model, masquerade. It's a total free enterprise giveaway masquerading as guardianship.
Yeah.
It's corruption of the idea of democracy itself.
Of the ideas,
So that's where I've got to, as it were, as far as the control system is concerned. Now I want to look a little bit more at system 2 because that seems to me to be very complex. So exploring the complexity of system 2. So for me, I've got this picture in my head, and I've had this for a long time, of the function of system 2, where at one end we're balancing the subunits, and at the other end we're starting from some basic rights and constraints, and then we're adding on as we go down the hierarchy. So level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 kind of thing, and as illustrated there in the standard kind of VSM way of illustrating it. Does that make sense to you? Yeah? And then in terms of supporting different cultures, I've got this kind of picture where this is the highest levels where you're putting in place the minimal rights and constraints, legal framework, and then as you go down you can add to that, and I've got now colours representing culture, if you like. I mean, it's a very loose metaphor, but it seems to be a good way of picturing it. So we add a bit of colour, we add a bit more colour, and then we add a bit more colour, and we can end up in very different places. So we can actually support very different cultures across the world without any problem. And again, interestingly, when the Soviet Union was first established, they were arguing for exactly this. They wanted to be able to support all their different cultures, but that soon fell apart. And there's a nice book which I can't remember the title now, but it's something like the development of the Soviet Union, which she went into one of the Soviet sub-states and investigated what had happened. And of course, it fell down because people in the middle didn't want it to work like that, so they tried to squash cultures as human beings seem to want to try and do. They want everybody to be the same, which is a ridiculous idea if you want to be able to be flexible. So you can start, oh there it is, I did put it on there, I've forgotten. So yeah, you might start from the World Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Rights of the Environment. That's our basic framework, and it's a minimal framework, and then you build on that towards different cultures. And that's what Goff was talking about, nested nationalism, making unmaking nations in the Soviet Caucasus. And they did set up to try and do that with that idealistic frame in the first place, but it fell apart very quickly. Quite difficult to do. Okay. So if we look at some of the mechanisms of System 2, so what I've done now is to go back to the control system idea, to look for those bits of the control system that we need to have in order to have a reasonable framework, and in order for that framework to be able to evolve. So we've got behaviors in relationships is what we're trying to regulate. And so we need processes to sense those behaviors, and that could be, sort of there's a formal system, the police picking up miscreants, and there is, of course, lots of informal ways of keeping people in line, the group think kind of stuff.
Facebook page is really good for that.
And then a comparator, a process to compare the behaviors to those considered acceptable, and because that's the court system at each level. So we've done away with a lot of our courts in this country now, so none of it works properly anymore, I think. And then an actuator to change behaviors in relationships. And that, to me, is the education system. So the PRISM system should be part of the education system, because that's the only way you're going to change behaviors in relationships. If you think about what you're trying to achieve, you don't want these people coming out and doing the same sorts of things. You want to change their behavior. And of course, where educational aspects have been brought into prison systems, that seems to work. All the evidence is it works, but all the evidence is the right wing doesn't seem to want that at all. It wants to be able to punish these people.
Educating allows them to think, and you don't want that.
Sorry?
That's it.
Educating allows them to think, and you don't want that.
Indeed. So, go on. So this is supporting the second and third purpose of the community collective at the first level. So the framework is coming down from System 2, or it's coming down from System 5. The current legal framework is what is embodied in the culture and being of this community, the one that we happen to be talking about. And of course there will be problems, so they've got to go back to System 5. And so there must be another level which looks even more complex, but I don't think it is really that complex. So we've got their whole System 5 groups with the problems coming up, and they are going to the System 2 at the next higher level and saying, okay, well, we've seemed to get these problems with our legal framework. The world has moved on. We need to change the legal framework in some way or another. So those change proposals for changes will go into System 3, become part of the conversation here. And System 5 at the next higher level is now monitoring that, and so can make changes, and so there can be agreed changes and coming back down to the legal framework, which is then getting applied down to the bottom. So we've allowed the changes to it. So we've now got something which will be dynamic, and there can be flows in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So here's what I said at the beginning, the remaining question. So the problem we got is, in many cases, the community has no way in which to constrain actions of those control organisations or property within their community. In our current system, we can shut down a village, as Thatcher did when she shut down the coal industry. There were we had communities which are entirely dependent on the coal industry, and therefore they those communities were just basically shut down. They had no means any longer of maintaining income except the small support that they got from our social.
Well, it's very pervasive, isn't it? Because in the same way the Tory government shut down the GLC because the GLC did not want to conform
Yes.
the ideology of the Conservative Party, so they just closed down the Greater London Council. That was the easy way for it to deal with the opposition.
Yeah.
Destroy a level of community government.
So this is the problem. How do we regulate organisations? And I mean, I have some thoughts but it's a complex question, because an organisation which might have its headquarters or even all its operations in one community might very well be drawing its supplies from several communities. It might be drawing its employees from several communities around it, and its products might be going out to an even wider. So where do we fit? Where and how do we fit that multi-level organisation into this structure, which seems to be very reasonably coherent for individuals, but now we've got to fit organisations into this. And how can we don't want them destroying the viability of these communities. So we've got to have some mechanisms here to tax, we were talking about earlier, these organisations so that they support the communities and support the infrastructure of those communities that they're based in, and we need to be able to think that through. So I don't know, I mean, how we do this, I'll throw that open.
There's a sort of presumption in favour of organisations under our current climate, isn't there? So, for example, in spite of all the people who live on the farm not wanting any fracking in their communities, they'll get fracking because a large organisation, which the government supports, will be allowed to do it. So we've got to change that sort of assumption that organisations, and the argument is always, well, they're the ones that are generating our wealth and providing jobs, and therefore you might not like exactly what they do locally, but they're really, really important to all of us. And somehow we've got to change that view that, because they're sort of zones of amorality, really, businesses, change the view that they should have the first say in what happens to our environment or our community.
So for me, it's about guardianship again.
Yeah,
yes.
It
The
is,
enterprise has to sit on guardianship, not the other way around.
And if we have
Yes.
the environment as regulated, as protected as we have other things, then that would be some way towards that, I think.
Yeah.
Because you could argue that you can't do this because it damages our environment.
But I mean, one of the questions there is, organizations have a purpose and they're optimizing for a certain output, in this case profit. And so the conversation is about like, well, how do we constrain the beast? Whereas like, well, shouldn't we change what they're incentivized by? Because I'm not, like we've created these like super organisms, and we're saying turn everything into profit. And by the stroke of a pen, you could say, well, your job is not primarily to respond to the needs of these ambiguous shareholders, but rather to maximize on a social or an environmental outcome. And that would have to be in conversation with society or even like the environment. And it flips the whole economy on its head a little bit, because there are these stores of value so that we can save into the future, so that we can pay for the goods and services that society needs. But arguably, if organizations were trying to meet those goods and services and not create them as a byproduct of profit maximization, then we might not need to save as much, because we just have the provision thereof.
Yeah.
So I think the whole, we shouldn't be trying to we shouldn't create Frankenstein and then control it. We should just like imbue them with a different outcome.
It's designing to optimise for the whole.
Yes.